Hello and welcome to the Import-Export Hub channel. Your host Bogdan here, and guys, without losing precious time here with lengthy introductions, as I'm sure that you all know what to do with the like, dislike and the subscribe buttons, let me cut to the case and start covering the imports and the exports for Vietnam in 2020, which is a very interesting country if you ask me, with a lot of opportunities. One of the new Asian tigers, if you want, that received a lot of foreign direct investments from 2005 onwards, and a country that is part of the next growth pole, if you want, in terms of manufacturing hubs. So coming back to the main subject of this video, as usual, I will go through the top performing sectors that drive Vietnam's exports. I will continue with the imports, and then I will finish by focusing on the top 5 sectors for each flow in order to see together who are the main trading partners. And of course, where possible, I will try to give you some examples in order to see what drives most of the imports and the exports of Vietnam for specific countries. And with this being said, let's start with the exports of Vietnam for 2020, who overall were up more than 6%, bringing the total exports to almost $281.5 billion in absolute terms, continuing, as you can see here, the upward trend from the last couple of years. In terms of the biggest trading partners, here I've highlighted the top 10 ones, and we see that the United States is the biggest export destination with more than 27% share in Vietnam's total exports, followed by China with almost $49 billion worth of exports in absolute terms. And on the third place, we have Japan, again in absolute terms, with almost $19.3 billion worth of exports. But there are other countries in this top 10 list, like, I don't know, South Korea, the Netherlands, or Thailand, just to name a few. Relative to the year-on-year changes, as I've said earlier, overall the exports were up just over 6%. Exports that were driven mainly by the very good performance in relation with the United States, China and Hong Kong, who all were up with 25, 18 and 45% respectively. Although there were some countries to whom the exports shrunk, like Japan, South Korea, India, the United Kingdom and Thailand, but not that much in order to change the overall export trend for Vietnam. Now, moving on to the import flow, we see that the imports were up 3% compared with the values for 2019, bringing the total imports to more than $261 billion, with China, South Korea and Japan representing the top three trading partners. But there are other important ones like, I don't know, the United States, Malaysia, Australia or India in this top 10 list, just to name a few. Relative to the year-on-year changes, these were up mainly because there was a strong import performance in relation with the biggest trading partner, which is China, but also from Japan and Taiwan, who both exported more towards Vietnam in 2020. On the other hand, there were also big contractions in terms of imported values with the United States, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia or India, ranging from more or less minus 1% to minus 9.7%. But then again, overall, these don't weigh that much in Vietnam's total imports. Now, relative to the balance of trade, and with this I'll finish the import flow. There is a lot of negative balance of trade with China and South Korea, which are the biggest one, which cumulatively I think is more or less $63 billion. But on the other hand, this is balanced by the huge positive balance of trade in relation with the United States, which is more or less the same amount, so $63 billion. And guys, with this being said, I will move on with the video and I will take the top 5 sectors for each flow in order to see together who are the main trading partners for Vietnam. And I will begin with the biggest driver of Vietnam's exports, which is Chapter 85. I think one of the most traded worldwide, along with his brother, if you want, Chapter 84. And we see that for 2020, the total exports from this chapter were around $111 billion, which is 14% more than the previous year in relative terms. And we see that the United States, China, and Hong Kong had the biggest positive year-on-year changes in relative terms. And also they weighed quite a lot in Vietnam's total exports, having a nice upward trend in the last couple of years, especially the trend from the United States, and not that much the trend with China and Hong Kong. As for the year-on-year changes, well, the United States, China, Hong Kong, and in a smaller amount, both in absolute and relative terms, the Netherlands, all experienced positive changes, while countries like South Korea, India, the United Arab Emirates, Austria, and Germany all had their imports from this chapter shrunk with values ranging from minus 1% to minus 23%, as in the case with the United Arab Emirates, for example. As for the main drivers, well, both for the United States and Austria, mobile phones is the main driver. And guys, with this being said, I will move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 84. And we see that these two had a big year-on-year change of roughly 41%, bringing the total exports of Vietnam from this chapter to more than $18 billion, with the United States, South Korea, and China the biggest trading partners, all with strong upward trends from 2016 onwards. Now, relative to the year-on-year changes, except with Singapore, with whom the exports fell with 1.3%, with the rest of the countries we see strong positive changes ranging from 3.5%, as the case with Japan, to more than 108%, as in the case with the United States. So quite a surge in terms of US imports. Relative to the main export drivers for this chapter, we have HS code 847130, so basically laptops driving most of the exports towards South Korea. And we have washing machines who drive most of Vietnam's exports towards Canada. And with this being said, I will move on to the third best performing chapter, which is chapter 64, so footwear. And although the trend from 2016 onwards was moving upwards, in 2020 the exports shrunk with more than 9%, bringing the absolute values to more than $17.2 billion, with the United States, China, and Belgium the biggest trading partners. Relative to the year-on-year changes, except with China, who had 13% increase, with the rest of the countries we see big decreases in terms of exported values, both in absolute and relative terms, especially towards the United States, Belgium, and Germany, who all unfortunately weighed a lot in Vietnam's total exports. As for the main driver from this chapter, as I've told you, we're talking about footwear, and for these two examples, it differs only the materials used, and we have HS code 640419 driving most of Vietnam's exports towards China, and we have HS code 640399 driving most of Vietnam's exports, towards the United Kingdom. Anyways, jumping on to the fourth export chapter for Vietnam, which is chapter 61, so articles of apparel and clothing accessories knitted or crocheted. This chapter 2 suffered a contraction compared with the figures from 2019, bringing the total exports to just over $13.7 billion, with the United States, Japan, and South Korea the biggest export destinations, but there are others like, I don't know, Canada, Germany, or France, just to name a few from this top 10 list. Relative to the year-on-year changes, except Canada and Belgium, who both imported more with 2.4 and 2.1% respectively, with the rest of the trading partners from this top 10 list, the contraction unfortunately are quite big, ranging from minus 1.4% to minus 13.3%, as in the case with France. As for the main drivers from this chapter, we have t-shirts, knitted or crocheted, and is the case with Japan, and women's or girls' trousers, as in the case with Belgium. And guys, with this being said, I'll move on to the last chapter from the export flow, which is chapter 62. Which is again articles of apparel and clothing accessories, but these are neither knitted or crocheted. And basically we have here more or less a copy-paste situation as the previous two chapters. We see strong positive upward trend from 2016 onwards, then bang, 2020, full pandemic mode worldwide. And remember that we're talking about discretionary goods. So basically the demand and thus the exports plummeted in 2020, except maybe the exports towards France, who imported with 1% more than they've imported in 2019. With the rest of the trading partner, we see lots of red, so big contractions everywhere, especially with the United States and South Korea, who unfortunately both weighed quite a lot in Vietnam's total exports from this chapter. As for the main export drivers, for Germany we have HS code 620343, and for France we have garments made up of felt or non-wovens, so HS code 621010. And guys, with the last export chapter being covered, I will move on to the import flow. I will try to pass as quickly as I can, and I will start with chapter 85, and we see that overall the imports accounted to more than $95.4 billion in 2020, which is almost 23% more than the figures of 2019, with China, South Korea, and Taiwan the biggest trading partners for Vietnam, but there are other important ones like Japan, the United States, or Singapore, again, just to name a few from this top 10 list. In terms of year-on-year changes, except with the United States and Thailand, whose exports towards Vietnam were down with 1.5 and 4% respectively, with the rest of the trading partners, there were big increases, both in absolute and relative terms, especially with China, South Korea, and Taiwan. Relative to the main drivers, here, as you might have guessed, we're talking about components needed for the final assembly for the mobile phones and, of course, other gadgets. And we have 854239 from the harmonized system code, driving most of Vietnam's imports from Taiwan, and the HS code 854231, driving most of the imports from Ireland. Now, moving on to the second biggest import sector for Vietnam, which is chapter 84, we see that here the volatility is quite high in terms of imports, up in 2017, down in 2018, up again in 2019, followed by 2020 with almost 8% decrease, bringing the total imports to more than $21.5 billion, with China, South Korea, and Japan the biggest trading partners. Relative to the year-on-year changes, we see lots of red in this top 10 list at least, ranging from almost minus 1%, as in the case with South Korea, to minus 36.5%, as in the case with Italy here. Relative to the main drivers, I've added here two examples, and we have air conditioning machines driving most of Vietnam's imports from Thailand, and HS code 848180 driving most of Vietnam's imports from Italy. Moving on to the third most important import chapter for Vietnam, which is chapter 39, so plastics and articles thereof. We see that in 2020 the imports were more or less at the same value with those from 2019, so quite stable, and you can easily see the flat line from 2018 onwards. In terms of cumulative imports, we're talking about $15.9 billion, with China, South Korea, and Taiwan representing the biggest trading partners. And except China, who had its exports towards Vietnam increase with more than 20%. With the rest of the trading partners from this top 10 list, the imports fell quite a lot, ranging from -2%, as in the case with Japan, to -14%, as in the case with Thailand and the United States. Although here, for these two countries, the absolute values are quite different. But anyways, in terms of the main import drivers, the ones coming from China are mostly driven by HS code 392690, and those coming from Saudi Arabia, which is a petrochemical exporter. We have polyethylene, so HS code 390110. And guys, speaking of petrochemicals and fossil fuels, I will move on to the next chapter that drives Vietnam's imports, which is chapter 27. So mineral fuels and oils, and we see that overall the imports shrunk with almost 17%, bringing the absolute values to almost $13 billion, with Kuwait, Australia, and South Korea the most important trading partners. In terms of year-on-year changes, except the imports coming from Australia, the Russian Federation, Thailand, and South Africa, which all had positive changes, with the rest of the trading partners, the imports shrunk both in absolute and relative terms. As for the main import drivers helping Vietnam's manufacturing activities, and not only, by providing the much needed energy, we have crude petroleum oils coming from Kuwait, and coal coming from South Africa. And guys, stay with me a little bit longer as we're approaching the end, but not before covering the last chapter, which is another important sector much needed for the manufacturing activities taking place in Vietnam. We're talking about chapter 72, so iron and steel, and we see that the imports shrunk with almost 13%, bringing the absolute value to almost $10 billion, with China, Japan, and South Korea the biggest trading partners. But there are others like India, the United States, or the Russian Federation, again just limiting myself to the top 10 list from this table. Relative to the year-on-year changes, except Japan, India, the Russian Federation, and Thailand, who all exported more in 2020 compared with the figures of 2019. With the rest of the trading partners, we see that the figures were much lower, both in absolute and relative terms, with China having the biggest decrease, continuing basically the downward trend from 2018 onwards. As for the main import drivers from this chapter, for both India and the Russian Federation, flat rolled products of iron and non-alloy steel represents the most important one. And guys, with this being said, I've covered everything that I wanted to cover in this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe buttons. And as usual, until next time, keep your business safe. Thanks.